I'm Monty Murray. I'm president of South Lake Conservationists, and we're very pleased to have our meeting tonight with our keynote speaker, which is Rebecca Skiba, who's the Coastal Regional Education Specialist with the Wildlife Resources Commission. Before we get started, I just want to give a really brief update. It won't take more than about a minute and a half about things that are going on with the chapter, and then we can give most of the time to Rebecca. So we've had a pretty interesting month, I have to say. We've been super busy, and it's been exciting too. We held our first Kids in Nature Day in May, on May 15th. And that was after about 6 months of planning. A lot of people, a lot of volunteers, a lot of organizations that partnered with us. And then we co-hosted it with the Triangle Land Conservancy. And by all accounts, it was pretty successful. So we were very, very excited about how that went. The kids really seemed to enjoy it, and the feedback we got in post surveys was very positive. So we're looking forward to planning the next one. Hopefully it won't take 6 months to plan this one, since we sort of learned a lot this time. The other thing that happened this past month is that, and I think I've mentioned this before, Katie Thompson is a teacher in Holly Springs in elementary school, and she has been working, she's a member of our chapter, and she's been working with her third grade student to write letters to all the mayors in Wake County to get them to sign up to the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which is a pretty significant commitment on the part of a town to supporting pollinators and having best practices around wildlife and so on. And so they succeeded with their letter writing campaign to get all 12 towns in Wake County signed up. So we have 100%. And so we had a celebration, which was pretty fun. And at the end of the celebration, they released all the butterflies. You can see a little picture in the upper right-hand corner, which is really cool. All these monarchs taking off in flight. So that was a pretty fun celebration. 4 mayors actually attended this celebration. And then the other thing, there's an upcoming event, which is part of our field trip series that Jennifer runs, Jennifer Mann, and she's the chair of the field trips. And the one that's coming up now is kind of consistent with Rebecca's talk. So we're kind of calling this Herc Month, I guess. So Rebecca's talking about the amphibians, and then on June 11th, Alvin Braswell, who's retired from the Museum of Natural Sciences, is going to take us out in the field at Harris Lake County Park on June 11th from 9 to 12 and look for reptiles and amphibians. I understand he's got a lot of interesting stuff to show and to share along the way. So check it out on the website, and you can see the website in the lower left-hand corner. If you haven't subscribed, please do. So I'd like to now introduce Rebecca Skiba. And Rebecca, I sort of snagged a photo from a video because I had a hard time finding it. So apologies if you don't like it. I think it's pretty good. Rebecca is a Georgia native, I guess. I don't know if that's all the way back to your childhood, but I know that you went to school there. And now you hail from somewhere in the Wilmington area. I don't recall the exact town. She teaches wildlife and train-the-trainer curriculum-based programming to educators and to the public in 34 counties. So that's a pretty wide swath. I understand she keeps very busy. She also was a featured lecturer in the MC Cooperative Extension program that was a course series that was offered last fall, which I was in, and the Backyard Naturalist series, which was just fantastic. She has experience as a sea turtle researcher, an environmental educator, an eco-tour leader, an oil spill effects on seabirds researcher, and a general wildlife educator. So she is well-rounded and really deep into the ecosystem for sure, and educating the public about it. Tonight, she will discuss the diversity of frog, toad, and salamander species in our great state, as well as the conservation threats facing them. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm very pleased to introduce Rebecca. Thanks for coming tonight, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Monty. And thank you, Kat, as well, for helping to moderate. And everybody else that's joined us tonight, thanks so much for having me. I have broken this talk up into a few segments where you'll be able to ask questions. So if you have the ability to unmute yourselves to ask me a question during those breaks, feel free. I just that way, you know, I don't know, some people get distracted by the chat. So if you're having issues doing that, please definitely put something in the chat so we can address it. And if we can't get to your question right away, we can address it later on as we go through. But let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And then Monty, I'm going to need your help telling me, making sure that it's on the current screen and not showing me the next screen. How's it doing? Okay, perfect.
Got it.
Awesome. Cool beans. Well, I'm going to minimize that since I don't want to just look at myself. So as Monty said, I do work in the education division, but the Wildlife Resource Commission is a state agency that I work for, and it actually has several divisions within that agency, and they work together in a multi-pronged kind of approach to conservation of our state's natural resources for current and future generations. So in the education division, one of my chief roles is to try to connect the public and educators with the most up-to-date information and research, as well as messaging that biologists would like to convey more intimately to the public, or things that they wish the public were more aware of. You know, in education, you come across a lot of old kind of fabrications or things that are just so outdated they no longer apply. And so honestly, like 98% of my job and in dealing with conservation probably has to do with managing perceptions and expectations in human and wildlife interactions. That is a key factor in conservation is, like I said, just kind of not running interference, but having people kind of understand that they're still part of the ecosystem and trying to squash the whole not in my backyard mentality, while at the same time, you know, being supportive and making sure that our wildlife as well as our constituents are taken care of and feel heard and feel safe and can actually appreciate the beauty and diversity of what we have around us. So it's a tightrope walk on the best of days. And sometimes, you know, you're not always going to win. But basically, we just try to grow awareness to individual actions and tolerance at a community level. So, you know, I know we've all been on vacation or had people visit us, and there's different expectations on how you act in certain towns or cities. And, you know, it'd be really nice if we can make sure that we have a community-wide, you know, ideology on that, or a way that we like to act and support our wildlife, or things that we don't do, like feed bears or alligators. So, you know, just we try to dispel those misconceptions, offer alternatives and solutions when there are some human-wildlife interactions. And then some of the things I'm going to talk about are diversity of different habitats that we have throughout our state, and why this state is just teeming literally with life from different amphibious species. So we are really in a beautiful cradle of many different ecotones, and I'm sure that's why you live here now. You really enjoy it, and we're all interconnected in this huge web. So we're going to address some of that. But I want to also take a little bit of time, at least in the beginning, to share some steps that the Wildlife Resource Commission is actually taking to have a positive effect or impact on these species that are under pressure, while also simultaneously I'm hoping to espouse a stewardship role, because I really hope that, you know, you realize that, you know, from the individual level to the municipal level to the statewide level, the decisions that you make even on a daily basis have a pretty big impact on our local amphibians as well as the greater population, and we'll get into that more as we go. But first, I want to do kind of a quick quiz for you. So you can just kind of keep this between you and the wall if you want to, or if you want to type it in the chat, feel free, and somebody can echo it out to me. But does anybody know what our state salamander is? I know this is a question that comes up all the time over the dinner table, right? State salamander. Any guesses? You got a guess from Dale. Anybody else? Okay. And this is a little tricky, right? Because then you have to actually know some of the names of our salamander species. So I will kind of put you out of your misery. It is our marbled salamander. Let me get this chat to go down so I can bring up a picture. Let's see, why isn't that going? There we go. So beautiful marbled salamander. This is your state salamander, your representative here in North Carolina. And the females are pretty vibrant. This beautiful kind of, again, marble, like granite almost kind of coloration on them. And this salamander is not a very large one, but it is a very pretty common one. And then I'm gonna, if you turn up your speakers, but not too loud, because I don't want you to get pushed back into the wall with the sound, I'm gonna play a frog call, and you can guess just by the call, but then I'll pick a picture up and see if you can guess which one this is. And to give you, well, no, I'll just play the call first and then I'll give you a clue afterwards. Any guesses as to what that frog is? Here's a picture of it. So this is one that is actually, I chose specifically because this is our state frog as of 2013. It's the Pine Barrens tree frog. So you might have seen it even on the Wildlife Resource Commission license plates or stickers and things like that. It also has a very limited range in the Piedmont. So kind of up here in kind of the Sandhills region, it's listed as a North Carolina threatened species. And we'll get into more of what it means to be state threatened versus federal threatened and that sort of thing. So I just thought we'd start off with fine tuning what we think about when we're talking about amphibians. So with management, being a state agency, it's a very awesome responsibility to look out for our game and non-game species that are here. And so we have a lot of dedicated staff and biologists and researchers, as well as people that handle land and water access and all kinds of just different things and habitat management, which we'll get into. And so with that, in order to get grant funding, but as well as to have a cohesive plan that we can all work under to meet these goals and these target objectives, basically, of managing our wildlife, again, not just for now, because we're already kind of on the backslide for now. We're really trying to catch up with a lot of these species as development and things like that are roaring on. But we also want to put them in a good spot so that future generations, we can share them with our grandkids and, hopefully the generations further past them. We actually get to have North Carolina stay North Carolina in terms of species richness and biodiversity. So wildlife is a public resource, and that's very much how we see it. And, like I said, this agency is charged with conserving and protecting and restoring and continuing our state's wildlife. So the only tricky part here is that the agency, we don't really have any regulatory authority over most of the habitat on which these animals depend. So that means private landowners, local governments, and the public all have a shared responsibility to protect and maintain our wildlife resources for now and for the future. Some of the negative impacts that are most commonly associated with rapid development in North Carolina pose a lot of threats to our wildlife species and the habitats that we identify as conservation priorities in this action plan. So we went further than to just say, hey, we want to target these species. We had to say, what habitat do they prefer, or where do we find them most commonly, and how do we work to protect those? Is somebody going to ask a question? I thought I heard some sound going on. Okay, I just want to double check. Just making sure. So we have different habitats that are actually of greater priority, and we'll get into that in just a little bit here as well. But when residential and commercial development occurs in a pattern, it doesn't take into account the needs of our wildlife, as well as what our wildlife needs to do seasonally, which we'll talk more about as well. But think about things like migration and mating and different seasons in terms of weather, what kind of cover they need to take. But the result is it's hard to come back from. You get degraded habitat, fragmented habitat, and it's just really, really hard to support populations of sensitive as well as moderate species in terms of sensitivity levels, because once you've put a road on it, once you've made a more permanent structure, development, or traffic pattern, it's really hard to kind of go backwards from that point. So the state and federal laws actually charge the Wildlife Resource Commission with protecting and managing and conserving aquatic, wetland, and upland habitats for the benefit of fish and wildlife populations. And we have an actual specific, the Habitat Conservation Program implements this mandate based on the Commission's policies and guidelines for conservation of those wetlands and aquatic habitats. So the goals are, we're going to enhance the wildlife and fisheries resources by assessing impacts and providing recommendations to avoid or minimize those impacts. And we do this through issuing permits and doing environmental document review. So we want to kind of meet with the people who are planning and figuring out what's the best way, maybe not, let's throw this back. This is a quick development, but what's the cost to our wildlife here? Another thing we provide is technical guidance with habitat conservation to private agencies as well as governmental agencies, but also to individuals that have you have a big plot of land or something and you want to figure out how to manage it, either for specific species or for the habitat itself. That's something that we do, on-site consultations for. And then we also work to repair habitats. So that means restoring degraded streams by correcting like problems in the riparian corridors that border it that have resulted in increased sedimentation and poor water quality, unstable stream banks through erosion and loss of aquatic habitat, and diminished, fish communities. And then we also try to encourage adequate, what we call mitigation for losses of fish, wildlife, and their habitats, resulting from land and water development. So sometimes, pollution, point source and non-point source pollution will work its way down and can have some pretty negative consequences as well. So according to the Wildlife Action Plan, it describes 17 river basins and 40 types of aquatic, wetland, and terrestrial natural communities found across the state, and it provides important habitat to our fish and wildlife. So the SGCN is the species of greatest conservation need. So as you see there in that first part of the table, that includes 51 different amphibian species, 93 different species of birds, 85 of fishes. I'm not trying to disrespect the crayfishes. I'm just moving down to some things that people might recognize. 28 different mammals, 43 different reptiles. And it all kind of factors out to being a huge number at the end of the day. And then we have what's called the knowledge gap for our priority species. So this is acknowledging that there's some things that maybe we don't have all the answers to how to fix it right away. So there's going to be some leeway, or if we work for one species, we're hoping to have a greater positive impact on some of the other surrounding species, but there's still more that we kind of need to understand because wildlife, they have very complex relationships with their habitat as well as with other species. So this is something that, when the numbers are already dwindling and they're getting harder and harder to find and keep track of and study, this is something we're acknowledging. So we're basically, instead of casting a small net and aiming low, we're aiming high and we're casting a bigger net to try to make sure that we give ourselves enough leeway to figure this out. And then of management concern, and these are ones that kind of fall under habitat management. Those are the lists of the priority species there. So this is a pretty big number when you see it. So trust me, I understand it's a bit of a shocker. We have a great diversity again in North Carolina, but this way we can again target those essential habitats, and we can strategically target the imperiled animals and their required habitats early and prevent them from becoming extinct. So these are not habitats, or these are not animals that are extinct. They are in danger of becoming threatened or extinct. So this is something that we're trying to avoid here. And so a state wildlife action plan actually emerges from a mandate from the US Congress that each state has to develop a comprehensive conservation strategy to be eligible for the federal funding under the State Wildlife Grant Program. So all 50 states in the US and several territories have actually developed their own state wildlife action plan, which is why when you go state to state, the way they manage might be a little bit different. So let's see, since submitting the state's first wildlife action plan in 2005, North Carolina has received an average of $1.3 million annually to support the implementation of these conservation actions laid out throughout this plan. And so mostly these funds have been used to support the wildlife diversity program, which again is the biologists that are doing the field work to fill these knowledge gaps and to figure out what we need, as well as the the habitat conservation and restoration projects that we're doing. So let's get into some of these species that would be on the list, okay? So as I mentioned, state listed species are those that are identified under our state wildlife action plan. And so they're separated into three categories. We have the North Carolina endangered, North Carolina threatened, and North Carolina of special concern. So those that are listed under the North Carolina endangered basically mean any native or once native species of wild animal whose continued existence as a viable component of the state's fauna is determined by the Wildlife Resources Commission to be in jeopardy, or any wild animal determined to be an endangered species pursuant to the Federal Species Act. Okay, so it's pretty similar in terms of that to what the federal listing for that is. And as you see here, so we've got a green salamander in the picture there, but an endangered, remember, that's pretty critical there. Gopher frogs, the hickory nut gorge green salamander, ornate chorus frog, and the river frog. Those that are North Carolina threatened species, so there's 7 amphibians there. The definition for threatened versus endangered Any native or once native species of wild animal that is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future through all or a significant portion of its range, or that is designated as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. So this is the step before endangered. And a lot of the Wildlife Action Plan is trying to target species at this level. Of course, we're trying to, again, take care of those that are endangered as well, but we're trying to prevent others from reaching the threatened status. So you might recognize there's a different green salamander there, a lot of different salamanders, the pine barrens tree frog that I had in the quiz earlier, eastern tiger salamander, and many others in there as well. And then that brings us to the final category of North Carolina special concern species. And this basically pertains to any species of wild animal native or once native to North Carolina that's determined by Wildlife Resources Commission to require monitoring, but that may be taken under regulations adopted under the provisions of Article 25 of the Wildlife State Plan there. So basically it's a state listing, special species listing, and that's designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's federal designations and their definitions. On this one, they kind of just leave us to say, hey, these are ones that are pursuant to whatever the state defines it as. So I'm talking a lot of words right now, but what I'm trying to say is in North Carolina, we define a species of special concern as one whose habitat is in jeopardy or in the foreseeable future we are losing it quickly, and we're not going to be able to regain this ground. A lot of that has to do to development, conversion of land to agricultural fields, treatment plants, land waste areas. A lot of it has to do with areas that are kind of falling under climate change, where we have significant droughts or weather disturbances and things that kind of affect the natural area and the way that it works. And so these areas, these habitats rather, that house these different species here, these are in kind of, I guess what we would say, fragile or increasingly fragile habitats. So that's why this is the step that we're looking at that's before threatened. So it goes special concern, threatened, and endangered. And you're probably wondering, well, why? I'm trying to give you hope. I started from endangered, and yes, the numbers are increasing, but these are the ones that we are looking out for in advance before we hopefully have a huge problem with them, so that we can keep them around for generations. And as you can see, we have a ton of different, from salamanders to tree frogs to water dogs and things like that, that's on this list. So I ran through that kind of quick because I wanted to get to the other good stuff there. Let's see, you said pictures, please. Oh, I'm not sure, Dawn, what you're talking about on that one. Sorry, I might have zoomed right by it. But does anybody have any questions about the Wildlife Action Plan or some of the things that we just talked about? You can unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And if I'm talking too fast, let me know. I get excited.
So can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Monty.
Yeah. So I mean, how are you approaching the private landowners? So I understand that's where most of the habitats are. How do you, how do you establish the relationship and do the influencing to get them on board with what needs to be done with their habitats?
Yeah, so that's a very specific task. So a lot of these private agencies and organizations, they generally want to be in good public standing and good favor. And when they realize that they have certain species, as long as it's not integral, I think, to how they function and what they're doing, if we try to put in ideas as far as like compromises, instead of just saying, no, you absolutely can't use this, unless there's something like an endangered species, then, we kind of have a way to be like, look, you really should do this. It's in your best interest to look out for the species because the range is limited, all these other things. But really, it's just about trying to build good relationships and support. And they also can use it as a way to kind of advertise for themselves as, hey, we're a part of the fabric of the community. And so it kind of varies organization by organization, but we can also find that's where different groups like, Audubon and the Nature Conservancy and stuff like that do like conservation easements, as well as the Wildlife Federation. A lot of us kind of shake hands with similar people or similar groups, and so there is a little bit of a heavier, I don't want to say lean, but more of an incentive for them to be like, hey, look, there's a lot of groups here that are all trying to work towards the same positive outcome, is there any way that maybe just this section, or we try to work out what the best possible solution is for that, or offer them options that, hey, if you're working over here, are there ways that we can manage this habitat? And so we have biologists that deal with that go on site, and just help them figure out how to best manage it without disrupting what they're doing. But again, that's something that I could probably get you guys, if you want more information on that, in touch with somebody that does it actually for their job title. But it takes a fair and balanced approach for sure, because you kind of have to see it from all sides and then see at the end, what are we trying to accomplish here and how can we get around to it? So it's definitely a lot of diplomacy in there as well. But we also can give tax breaks is another thing. So it's another incentive that's in there. And so that's kind of something that we have that some companies might be interested in, if they, basically kind of help protect some of our wildlife species with minimal or maybe even moderate effort, then, maybe they may benefit from a tax break or in good faith. So let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll up in the chat here. All right, so let's see. All right, and Don, pics of all the threatened amphibians. I mean, I didn't put a bunch of them on there on the sheet there, but you can definitely, I'll show you a resource where it'd be really easy to kind of find those. Let's see. How many acres is the area biologists are documenting? Does the public get involved and help out? So it's kind of, as far as with the biologists, the approach that they take is more of a transect or type of survey route. So they find the habitats depending on what species they're monitoring and figure out, not only seasonality, but they do different transects where they figure out the time of year, if like, for instance, with amphibians, if they're moving down to their mating grounds or their breeding grounds, they're trying to figure out abundance. So some of them will do trapping methods. The public, we do have citizen science programs, and I'm actually going to talk about it at the end, where the public can get involved and definitely does help out, because we just do not have enough biologists to cover every square acre, let alone to cover the amount of work that they're trying to do. And so actually having the public get involved and help out is basically like adding hundreds of biologists boots on the ground. So it is very, very helpful. But as far as the acreage, I don't think so we have biologists that are, for instance, located in the Piedmont or the mountains, or, but they just kind of follow whatever species they're going on, like whatever they're pursuing at the time. And I know they have multiple sites. Sorry, I don't have more detail on that. Is there a group at NC protecting vernal ponds? So there are vernal ponds in a lot of the habitats, or ephemeral ponds, as we call them down here. I know that it's a split hair thing. I think vernal is kind of more of a northern term, but yeah, a lot of the habitats that we do protect have vernal or ephemeral ponds in them. And so, depending on, again, we don't have the regulatory authority if it's private or privately owned land. All we can do is offer incentives and try to educate people and put them in the right direction for protecting that property. But we do take our aquatic habitats very seriously, because not only does it benefit those that are living there, but everything else literally travels miles from around to use them for survival. So we have an extensive game land system in North Carolina as well. I'm not sure how many throughout the state that you've been able to visit, but a lot of those have either more permanent or river-fed systems or ephemeral ponds as well that are in those. And those areas in the game lands are protected. And we also, have the benefit of having some wildlife refuges throughout the state as well. That's also helpful. But I know that city and state parks as well cover some nice swaths of habitat, again, that seem to have a lot of these water features in them. Now, like I said, when it comes to private property, all we can do is hopefully instruct them and give them all the information they can to make the best of their habitat in terms of keeping pollution out of it, keeping it as a viable source for our amphibian species that are there. So, but they're not specifically just for the vernal ponds. It's, again, they're kind of biologists that are after, say, like Jeff Hall is our herpetologist, our state herpetologist. He does everything from, snakes, amphibians, and he covers a lot of these areas and works in a lot of areas, like with the Department of Defense, for all kinds of different snake species and things, and a lot of the game land habitats and things. And we'll get into that a little more when we start talking about the gopher frog and its conservation journey. But, you know, so a lot of those areas, like I said, when you take the habitat approach, you do kind of account for those features. Any other questions before I move on? It's okay if you do, we can get to it in the next round. We won't take too long on this one before we move on. All right, well, I'm going to jump ahead. It'll let me. Okay, so one of the things I do want to share with you over the next 3 slides, these are kind of like cut images of, and this is a small sampling of the salamanders that we have in North Carolina, but we redid our salamander posters, and we do have those. If you're interested in getting some, both Monty and Tara and I have talked about ways to make these posters available to you if you want to pick them up. They're very visually appealing, and what's great is that they also come with index cards that have, for every salamander that's featured on this poster, it's basically a species profile with like the quick links or the quick features about the species biology, their diet, you know, where they prefer to live, what part of the country they're in, so forth. So that way you don't have to worry about, well, if I hang this poster, am I covering information on the back? This is a lot more visually appealing, and then you can have the information to use. And that was designed for educators, hopefully, to use in the classroom as a kind of an interactive teaching tool. But North Carolina is actually home to more than 60 species of salamanders, which is more than any other state in the southeastern United States. Salamanders are a diverse group of tailed amphibians, and although they're closely related to frogs, they look more like lizards with slender bodies, and they have blunt snouts and short limbs, as you can see here. They can be found in both aquatic and terrestrial habitats, but they require water. It's essential for survival. So salamanders actually have a wide variety of reproductive techniques, and some lay eggs in the water that develop into larvae and eventually adults. Some retain larval characteristics in adulthood, and still others have direct development with no larval stage at all. Some salamanders have lungs, others have gills. Some only breathe through their skin, and some use all of the above. They just, you know, whatever works for them. So in North Carolina, salamanders also range very much in size. So as you can even see from this picture here, with the very large salamanders being more than 2 feet long to very small, which is literally an inch, you know, maybe a couple inches there. And they can be found in a wide variety of our habitats across the state, and this depends on the species. Now, most salamanders are nocturnal and can be found underneath rocks or fallen trees. And North Carolina actually has an abundance of salamanders because of its diverse geography from the mountains to the coastal swamps. So there are some species that are indigenous only to North Carolina, and they need to be conserved. One such family of salamanders is the Plethodontidae family. And this family consists of more than 90% of salamanders. And the Southeast US has more plethodontids than anywhere else in the world. So they are pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. And like I said, this is a poster. I just showed you like 3 kind of pictures of it, but we do have it available to you, and we'll work out the details and share that with you shortly. So just to kind of tell you a little bit more about what our Wildlife Management Division does, and maybe to kind of better answer or give you a better understanding of how the biologists kind of tend to do their work. So in early spring of 2022, wildlife diversity staff actually focused terrestrial surveys on a rare little studied woodland salamander. This guy lives in the mountains. It's called the southern zigzag salamander, and it's listed as state special concern and is a species of greatest conservation need in our wildlife action plan. The southern zigzag salamander can actually be difficult to find outside of early spring because they have a tendency to remain underground in the loose, well-drained soils and rocky slopes during the warmer months of the year. So again, nocturnal, trying to find things that are hiding under things all the time can be a pretty difficult job. So the distribution of these salamanders is actually pretty poorly understood and currently includes only 3 mountain counties in the greater French Broad River Valley. So Buncombe, Madison, and Yancey. Historical museum records also include 1 record of each from Henderson and then 1 from Haywood. So the biologist's main objective this spring was to expand their knowledge of where the species occurs. And the staff, they surveyed 20 sites in Buncombe and Madison counties, finding southern zigzag salamanders in 7 but 6 of those were actually new sites. So that was actually a really good discovery for them. So as you see, again, they kind of have to cast a really wide net. And if they just focus on specific areas, then the next year, if they don't find anything within that specific season where they feel like they'll have the greatest opportunity to come across them, then, they can add more routes to the following year. So all of these southern zigzag salamanders that were actually found on public lands, including both east and west sides of the French Broad River. And in the past surveys, the relative abundance of the southern zigzag salamanders has been low compared to more commonly found salamanders. But this spring's results were similar, with only 42 individuals found in total. So future survey work will continue to focus on understanding the distribution of this rare species in North Carolina. But that just kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding of kind of how we do some of our work here. And here's some great photos, up close photos of it up here on this moss. And let me see, I know we've got probably some questions on salamander. Type of salamander I see around the foundation of my house. That's a great question. I am not sure. Where do you live? We have the greatest diversity of our salamanders in the mountains, I'll tell you that. So if you ever get to go up to Purchase Knob in that area, the park rangers will actually take you up into those, into the beautiful ferns, spruce forests up there. And you can literally just lift up logs and things like that and find salamanders hiding underneath there. And they have a great dichotomous key for figuring out what you have. Like 2/3 of the state salamanders live in the mountains as far as diversity goes. And yes, Jesse, that's a great suggestion. Seek is a fantastic app to use if you want a really quick ID instead of submitting it to iNaturalist. But Seek is a really great way to get answers, especially if you're in an area where you're not quite sure where it is. But depending on, so you're in Charlotte, so we can actually, we can narrow it down. I'll show you another resource later that maybe we can help you find the salamander, because I think pictures will really help you. So I promise it's in my slides. I'll get to it because I think this resource is something everybody should honestly have saved on their computers, because it will help you with snakes. It will help you with lizards, literally anything reptile and amphibian. And it's a fantastic guide written by great researchers and those that are the best in their field. Any other questions about salamanders? I'm trying to, I know we could, if I could just have like one just on salamanders or just on frogs and toads, it would be a full hour for each for sure. But I know we don't have that kind of time tonight. So sorry if I'm racing. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. Okay. Well, if you have any other questions, just let me know. We're going to talk a little bit about frogs and toads and some of the work that we have going on with them.
Let me just add that if somebody would like to just ask a question verbally, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question. It doesn't have to be typed in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we'll jump over to frogs and toads then. So we have, as I mentioned before, with the various habitats and kind of climates and ecotones that we have, with our many river systems and the way our state does the drains and the water basins and things that we have in our different various watersheds. North Carolina is home to about 31 species of frogs and toads. So you'll see the number change a little bit. Some of that is due to classification. For instance, now they have the southern leopard frog, and then they now have what they consider to be, I think, a subspecies, the Atlantic coast leopard frog. And it's one of those things that if you have both in hand, you really have to look like you have to be basically a biologist that works with them all the time to really split hairs and find a difference with them. But so that's why you might see the number waver a little bit here and there, but don't get too caught up on that, because we joke that we have lumpers and splitters. And so, we get the classification systems down and things, and then, give it 10 years or something. Somebody will come in and be like, we should organize them like this. But there are 5 different families. So, and if you think about it too, starting up in the mountains, for instance, Haywood County is actually its very own watershed. So all of its water, its rivers and streams actually start in Haywood County. So when you're thinking about salamander and amphibian diversity, but especially salamander diversity, you don't get fresher, cleaner waters than you do in the mountains, because like everything flows its way down to the coast and it picks up all kinds of pollution and sedimentation and things like that, So that's probably another reason, that and the temperatures and the way the forests, the pH of the forest floor, the types of plants they can hide underneath, and those sorts of things. Those conditions where the ponds don't dry up as readily, say over a hot summer. Those are all things that probably really contribute to greater salamander diversity in the mountains. But I know a lot of people don't think mountains and salamanders go together, but now hopefully you won't forget it. But virtually every part of North Carolina has at least one frog or toad species. And frogs and toads belong to a group of tailless amphibians known as anurans, which have hind legs and they're modified for jumping. And most of them have moist skin and webbed, unclawed toes. Now, there's some species like bullfrogs that have smooth skin and elongated hind limbs. And then there's others like toads that have warty skin, stout bodies, and pretty short hind limbs. But don't take this on faith. So there are some toads, as we'll see, that actually have smooth skin and they're not warty, and some frogs that are warty. So some species can actually change colors. So from the moment you capture them, if you're out catching frogs, just to get a better look at them, to, they change colors depending on environmental conditions and the time of the day that they're active. So that can change things too, which is why it's nice to have a variety of pictures when you're trying to identify something, or just give it some time before looking at it again. So amphibian literally just means both lives, and refers to the fact that most frogs and toads have an early gill-breathing larval stage, being a tadpole, and then later turn into air-breathing adults, and then later on. So as people are well aware, frogs and toads actually play a really important role in our natural ecosystems. They eat countless of insects and other invertebrates, and some species, really large ones like bullfrogs, can actually eat other frogs, toads, snakes, turtles. Bullfrogs are they are big carnivores, so they'll eat a lot of big things that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to. Frogs and toads also serve as an important food source to many other fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals as well. So they're very interconnected in this web of life and the food chain as well. I know that a lot of times we think of frogs and toads as being good bioindicators, and it's not that they're not. However, recent research has shown that they may not be as overly sensitive as we think they are. Invertebrate macroinvertebrates in the water are actually a better indicator than frogs and toads, because we have found that some frogs and toads can have some type of tolerance to, say, things like heavy metal accumulation and things like that. Now, granted, obviously, there is a limit. They're not like, the Keith Richards of animals, right? So they won't put up with just anything, but there is a tolerance level there. And so greater sensitivity kind of comes with the aquatic insects that you see. So another thing that's concerning for different frog species, I know, is like the viral infections. Jeff Hall, our state herpetologist, said that viral infections aren't really a huge issue for coastal plain species of frogs and toads and amphibians, because the temperatures are just too high for the fungus to really take hold and effect. But mountain species are a bit more susceptible to fungus that'll grow in ponds because it's cooler, and it may linger in ponds that don't evaporate all the way. And so, just depending on the climate, but that's a good thing about having them, different species and different stretch throughout the range. And that's probably why each species is adapted the way that they have. And again, remember, both lives. So even though they're living in the water with their gills in the beginning as tadpoles, and they move on to land, that's another kind of adaptation of not being susceptible to your environment. You're moving and you're changing things up a bit. So some of the different families, we're just going to go through some of the 5 families, and I did put pictures in here so you could see all of them. So I'm so sorry that they weren't listed on the first few slides, but I was just like, holiday, kind of thinking like Madonna here. So this group is, they're very skilled in their calls and varied in pitch and range. So in the Hylidae family includes tree frogs, chorus frogs, and cricket frogs. And all these frogs are actually listed from left to right, top to bottom in order of appearance. So starting with the northern cricket frog in the top upper left corner, the southern cricket frog. These are the 2 that sound like marbles clinking off. And then we have the mountain chorus frog, Brimley's chorus frog to complete the top row. And then upland chorus frog, southern chorus frog. The little grass frog is the 3rd one in, sitting on that gentleman's finger there. This is one that not everybody can hear, because the pitch, the frequency is so high that when some people, you just can't hear that range. And I'm talking, it's very high pitched, almost more, actually, I think it's probably higher pitched than most bird calls. But they are super teeny tiny. This is a fully grown adult here on the fingertip. So they are teeny tiny. A lot of people actually mistake them for being baby frogs or young frogs, but that's their full adult size there. And then the ornate chorus frog next to it. And then below the spring peeper, this is the first one calling. It sounds like peep, 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 peep. They're really loud. Everybody hears them. They're our winter callers. So we first hear them calling. And then next to that spring peeper is the Cope's gray tree frog, the common gray tree frog. And you can see that one has a very limited range on there. So much so that you can barely see it there on the coastal plains. The green tree frog with the nice white stripe down it. This is the one that clings to your windows if you have the AC running. And then below it, the pine barrens tree frog, the barking tree frog. This is one that is for sure one that changes color and it feels like it has a warty appearance to it. The pine woods tree frog, and then the squirrel tree frog finishing out with its calls. Now let's see, Jesse, you raised your hand. Do you have a question or something to say? Monty, you may need to unmute.
Okay, just unmuted. I was just wondering if there's a website to go to hear the sounds of the frogs. Is it the Herps, North Carolina Herps or something?
Yeah, so I have two sites for you that I'm going to present to you later. I also am putting it in. So this is probably a really good time to kind of tell you. I put together a list of like different links on the internet for different great resources regarding salamanders, amphibians, toads, conservation projects, citizen science things, as well as where to go to hear the sounds or the calls for like frog calls and things like that. And so I'm definitely going to address it later, but it will be in your list of resources as well for you to have so that you can click on it. And there's some that you can take a quiz so you can kind of practice. And that's part of getting ready for some of the citizen science stuff there. So
great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, happily. And Bill, honestly, I may have to get back to you on that because I don't know that salamanders have secretions that are toxic. I know some people have said that the hellbender has poisonous secretions, but it's been found to be not true. But I don't want to say that some people wouldn't have a type of reaction to it. But I want to make sure I give you a well-informed answer to that. And since I work mostly in the coastal plains out here, I'm like I said, I deal with maybe like 10 salamander species. So to my knowledge, none of those have any kind of a toxic secretion. But if it's okay with you, Bill, I'll make sure to get your email address or I can send the answer to Monty and he can probably send it to the group as well. So I want to remember to get that answer direct from the biologist, just in case he has something that's very specific, because there's a lot of salamanders that I don't specifically work with, but I don't want to leave you hanging. I'm sorry. That's the one thing that's frustrating when you're when you're just an educator and not a biologist. They have all the best information because they work with them in the field all the time. But I want to address it for sure. So I will ask and get a better answer on that. So the next family is the Ronidae family, where there's 8 species of what they call the true frogs. And we call them true frogs because most people expect frogs to be in the water. So these are ones that you will see hanging around a lot of these ephemeral ponds or more established ponds. So the first one, the American bullfrog, Jeremiah over there, these can get several pounds, very big frogs, and they have a powerful kick. They can leap 6 feet in a single jump, no effort whatsoever. And what you might see on the backs of these frogs is it looks like their hip or their pelvic bones are shooting up. Some of these, like the leopard frog and a couple of them, you can kind of see the pronounced bump that's on the lower side of their back. And that's literally, where their legs fold up into that and then they jump and they fully extend that. So then we have the green frog. Some people also call it the bronze frog. And this is one that gets confused a lot for the American bullfrog. And as you see, their ranges overlap. Now, the tympanum, or that earpiece that's on the side that looks like a boom system or a speaker system there, when you're looking at leopard frogs, when you look closely at them, you'll be able to tell some differences. But when you pick up a bullfrog, one of its tactics for survival is it will go completely limp and play dead. So that's one of the things that you'll notice when you pick up the bullfrog. They have very extensive webbing on their feet. All of these frogs do as well. And that's because, again, they're mostly in the water foraging. We also have the river frog. So that's one, as you can see, has a very select habitat range that it's in. Its numbers are dwindling. That's definitely one of the ones that's one of our state listed species. The southern leopard frog, this is the one that sounds like somebody is kind of rubbing on a balloon to kind of get that kind of sound. They are also really good jumpers. And then I have the pickerel frog next to it because it often gets mistaken for the southern leopard frog. It has some overlap in the range between the two, but if you look at the pickerel frog, it has kind of more 2 lines of organized boxes that go down its back, whereas with the southern leopard frog, it's kind of more splotchy, elongated, not really boxes. They're kind of shapeless and varied. So it might help you to see that. Some people, I think it does, some people get more confused, but, and then we have the pickerel frog, and then, let's see, the wood frog, carpenter frog. I guess my wood frog didn't show up. I'm sorry about that. Is it an animation? So we're missing the wood frog on there, but then we have the gopher frog in the middle. I'm sorry, and the carpenter frog. I have to make a note to, I think it maybe jumped behind the others. So then we have the family Bufonidae, which is our true toads. So when people tell you, oh, you know, you'll get warts if you pick up toads, these are the ones that we think are, we call toads because they have that kind of warty skin. They have this gland, as you can see right back here. It's kind of the shape of a little kidney right there. So we have the American toad, the Fowler's toad, the southern toad, and then the oak toad. As you can see on these, the range is a little bit different. So if you're up in the mountains in the Piedmont area and some select portions of the coast, up in the northern portion of the coast, you will hear the American toad. And a fun fact, I had a friend that moved to Wisconsin, and the only toad that they have is the American toad. So they don't even have 4 toads like we do in our state. Fowler's toad has a pretty good distribution. The southern toad, this is definitely a coastal plains toad. And then the oak toad. They all scream at kind of a louder, kind of a more persistent, constant, and some of them have a higher pitched or lower pitch, but they're just kind of the ones that you hear out at night, maybe in your neighborhood, and they just sound like they're just screaming constantly. They're not taking breaks. It's just a long, I can't even do it well enough, but you know, just, they are the ones that you're hearing usually is the toads. The frogs are the ones that tend to take a little bit of a break in between. So if you notice looking at these, you know, we got kind of a warty, we got the parotenoid gland there. We've got some of the cranial ridges and bumps and things, but some of these bumps actually help us with identification. So if we're looking over the top of a toad here, we actually can kind of help identify what we're seeing by the way that those glands and everything, are organized. So the first one, the first picture on the left is the Fowler's toad. Okay, and it says that parotid gland, which are those bumps there, touches the postorbital ridge. So all that means is that kind of defined area behind the eyes, the parotid glands are going to touch that. So it comes connected to that. Whereas the American toad in the middle, it's separate. Okay. And then, or it's connected to it only on one side. So it's just, you have that space in between. And when you're looking at the southern toad, which is the last one on the right, you have the knobs that are in the rear of like the inside. So before, we're adding basically 2 knobs in the middle of the face of the southern toad there. And then we have those extended areas that are touching the parotid glands. So another thing that might help you if you're looking at all this is to look at the range maps for where these guys are located, depending on where you are. So for instance, if you can't figure out if it's a southern toad or a Fowler's toad, depending on where you are, that range map might figure that out for yourself. If you're trying to tell the difference, a lot of times people have trouble telling the difference between an American toad and a southern toad by their call, because they have virtually the same call, but one is a higher pitched and one is a little bit of a lower pitch. So sometimes it really helps to have that toad in hand so that you can kind of figure out, you know, what you're looking at. I always say this, if you can have wet hands or moist hands when you're picking up amphibians, please do. We also suggest that you use filtered water if you are trapping amphibians, either for education or for you to look at or anything like that. You know, using filtered water is best for them. So like a Brita pitcher, you know, that way, you know, that, you know, they don't get all the chlorines and the things like that that dry them out or just affect them. They absorb everything through their skin. So the best, I'd recycle like peanut butter jars and poke holes in the top of them and put some distilled water in, then just so I can get enough chance to keep them kind of comfortable and I can identify them if I have another one. And I collect them for programs and then re-release them where I found them. So that's kind of my MO, what I get to do when I get to get up close. But it is pretty neat when you have 2 toads in hand and you're trying to check them out and see what's there. However, you will see sometimes when the toad is stressed, these parotid glands, these big, like I said, kidney shapes, they'll start to secrete like a white, silky or milky fluid, okay? And that's because if you're, for instance, you ever seen your dog pick up a toad and he starts foaming at the mouth, or he just spits it out? That's kind of like, it's not necessary, it's a toxin for sure. I don't know if it's enough of a toxin to kill anything here. We don't really have super potent ones, but it's definitely a deterrent, and it's a way that they're able to survive because they secrete that. It tastes bad at the animal in whose mouth they're in, and so then they spit them out. So that is a toxin, but if it's on your skin, again, depending on how your sensitivity level ranges, you know, you definitely want to wash your hands anytime after dealing with these animals, but don't use hand sanitizers when handling amphibians. That alcohol is not good for them. So, but again, looking at these ideas of the shape of the head and what's touching and that kind of level of detail is really helpful. But when the range maps don't suffice, I'll show you again at the end some areas you can practice your songs and your skill sets there, as well as projects you can get involved in that'll help you a little bit more. Yeah, so the screaming are definitely toads. And if you're near a culvert or a ditch or anything like that, or if you have an area like that in your neighborhood, either just before it rains, or if you feel safe bringing your friend or going with your dog or something to check it out, you'll kind of hear the difference in the frogs and how they have the kind of, it's like they're speaking in syllables, whereas a toad is just dragging it out. So, and let's see, I had somebody raise their hand. I think it popped up on my screen. Was it Ginger? Ginger, are you able to unmute yourself, or do you want me to keep rolling and wait for the next question section?
I don't see a hand raised, Rebecca.
Oh, maybe it was the chat that came up. Well, either way, we'll take another break for questions here in a moment, but I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anybody. And then another family we have is the microhalidae. I love these guys. These are my favorite. Some people say they're eastern narrowmouth toads. And if you look at them, they're actually a very smooth toad. They have like kind of a gravelly granite kind of appearance down their side. These toads live pretty much their entire life underground. They're explosive breeders. And they're called the narrowmouth toad because their mouth literally opens only wide enough to eat ants. That's what they specialize on. Here's a male and a female that the biologist is holding there, and you can tell by the darkness of the throat patch there. So these are the ones that sound like screaming sheep. So they have a very powerful, when we have really big rain events, these guys burrow up from underneath the ground for mating, as well as our eastern spadefoot. I love these guys. These are super duper tiny. Oh, one little note on the eastern narrowmouth. If you're out road cruising or you're catching anything, a lot of people, they see toads, or if you're looking for leaves on the road, you'll start to understand and notice, oh, that's a toad hopping, because they bounce on their butt. I always joke it's like a gorilla that just bounces on its butt and doesn't have back feet, and that's their posture. But when it comes to frogs, you know, they have they bounce a little bit forward. They make more progress than a toad. But the eastern narrowmouth toad, when you see it, it has this it almost looks like a moth moving on the ground. And then the eastern spadefoot right here, this guy's a good looking fella here. He gets its name because he's actually a really good digger. He can dig straight down, and he does so because he has that spade on his back foot, that little, you see that articulated black portion there on his back foot. He uses that and can literally kick earth away really, really quickly in order to tunnel straight down and hide. So these are tiny as well. And as you can see, they have some areas, different ranges where you can find them further out in the western portion of the state. This is very much a coastal species that's out here. And it also, again, another explosive breeders there. Ooh, Bill, that's a very specific question. I'm not sure if they know enough to know the percentage of each species, but I guess it would depend on the town. So, you know, definitely by county, I know that there's probably some that are more common, but really, I guess the question breakdown would be is which particular habitats. So I don't know if it's just, you know, some of those toads are predominant more so in the sandhills. Honestly, a lot of these toads overlap in range because they have either the ephemeral ponds or they have more permanent pond structures, as well as with the same weather events. And so if the temperatures stay pretty consistent, the temperatures usually around water are at least 10 degrees consistent. But, you know, if predation levels aren't high, and if they have enough of that surrounding habitat that is managed very well with prescribed burns and other things like that, which we'll get into, you know, I think that they all pretty much share that habitat I don't know what the percentage or equally is. With the surveys that they do, we do acoustic monitoring for them, because you can go out and you can capture, but depending on your survey effort, how many nets and traps and stuff that you put out, you still don't really know if you're getting a clear picture. But basically we do kind of relative abundance surveys in terms of, are they here, are they present? And so I don't know how they would put that into a statistical analysis on percentage, but I can definitely ask. I'm not sure though. Those are where we have had reliable sightings and hearing of those species in those areas for over a significant portion of time. That's both from biologists as well as citizen scientists and other projects that are out there. I'm sorry, I don't have like specific laser point answers on those, because a lot of with biology right now, like I said, is for these biologists to go out to these habitats and survey and sample. We're really just looking for presence or absence. And then if they're there, they go back and they say, okay, well, if this species is like spatial concern, or if they're, their habitat is threatened, okay, how are they doing reproductively? Are we seeing many of these, or are they occurring less and less? And so that kind of all falls into the wildlife action plan, which is why they focus a lot on the habitats that we see these guys using, because historically, a lot of those habitats, again, they get developed, or we have development around that increases sedimentation, and it just kind of ruins the whole area. And then so, we may have had a specific toad or something in one habitat historically for 40 years. And then in the last 10 years, suddenly you can't hear it anymore. You can't find it. On the coast, one of the natural features that actually affects our frogs and toads in abundance is hurricanes. So, for instance, with regards to, I think it's the chorus frog that we had, or no, sorry, it's the Cope's gray tree frog out there. I know that for a while, after hurricanes, they decimated and polluted a lot of the areas, or at least where we had significant populations of them. And one individual, I won't name any names or anything like that, had reestablished a population, I believe, behind the aquarium over here. And so you can kind of hear them only in one particular area along the coast now, because a lot of them just either didn't survive or moved on, further inland. So great question, though. Again, I'm sorry I don't have the more specific answers, but I don't know that we actually have that yet. But it would be great to be able to know that. Jesse.
Okay. Sometimes when I'm walking along the greenway, I see a box by the creek, and I was just wondering, how often do the biologists survey them?
Like, how often do they check the traps and things like that?
Yeah.
So anytime you set a trap, you're going to check it within a 24-hour period, at least. At the very longest, that's the longest you're ever going to leave it. Chances are good that they're probably setting it either early in the morning or in the evening, and are checking it either the next morning or the next evening. So usually they don't go longer than an 8 to 12-hour window, because if you do catch something live, you don't want to have it be a mortal event for that animal. So you don't want to put it in for instance, you don't want it to get in a trap with something that could eat it and kill it. You don't want to leave it in there, and then maybe it's feeling extreme temperatures during the day when it could burrow down to safety, during those hotter temperatures and things. So when they set traps, they come back and they check them usually within a 12-hour period, but they never, ever leave them longer than a 24-hour period unmonitored, or at least where they have technicians that come out and survey what's there and let things go.
Yeah, it's like a 4x3 box. I don't know if we're allowed to look in there, or...
Well, I don't know what they're surveying for. So
okay.
I guess it would be if you're prepared to find whatever's in there. I don't know. It could be water snakes. It could be amphibians. It could be amphiumas, and those can put on a nasty bite. So be careful with those. It could also be salamanders, and there's all kinds of different trapping and netting things. I know with the University of North Carolina, Wilmington had somebody, I don't know if they patented it or what, but they basically have what we endearingly call a mop trap, where it literally looks like a mop head in a bucket that they throw in the water, and the mop actually acts like aquatic vegetation, and so the salamanders and other things are attracted to it. And so then when they lift that thing up, they usually get a lot of stuff that's been hanging out in there after a day, where it's just on the bottom of the mop, so they're not trapped in any way. But again, once you set that out, you really want to revisit that, because the whole point is not to add greater pressure to what these things are going through.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry. I guess I would check for any kind of lettering or any kind of identification on that, if it's with a university or if it's with like a state agency or a nonprofit, or, you know, like many of the different agencies that are out there. There's so many projects that are going at once, but usually it's sponsored or grant funded. So normally there's some kind of a paper trail or something. I'm not sure who manages the greenway that you're on, but I bet if you call up the front office, they'd probably be able to know, or at least one of the local parks might be aware of it, because they often have to ask for permission to even be on the property and in that area. Since it's public domain, they still, to run any experiments, there's, you know, the permitting and all the process that go through it. Let's see, got another in the chat. Oh boy. Okay, we gotta get cruising, Monty. I'm so sorry. All right, so Green Growth Toolbox, I'm just going to zoom over this really quickly. This is a tool or a program that we have at the Wildlife Resources Commission to work with cities and town planners and municipalities before they bid in those neighborhoods, before they develop those areas for, you know, high traffic zones and you know, areas that we gather for, I don't know, movie theaters and all kinds of other development and things that are in there. So again, since, you know, we don't have a regulatory authority over most of this habitat, you know, we have to kind of really bring to light some of the negative impacts that are associated with, you know, the development of these areas. And so some of the recommendations that we make are just things that we would hope that these planners would take into account. And they can be as something that seems as minute and as easy to comply with as, let's make our curbs lower so that turtles crossing the road are able to get up over it and they're not trapped where they're just going to get basically beaten up by cars back and forth. And so little things like that, they're basically just little suggestions that a developer might be like, hey, yeah, we can do that. And then we can say, hey, that saved us either money on concrete or something, or we could just say, hey, we're, you know, an eco-friendly or at least a wildlife-friendly, you know, kind of development too. So with this particular program, for instance, I'm just going to go over some of the things briefly that they talk about. So core terrestrial habitat consists of a wetland itself and 750 feet of protected upland habitat beyond that wetlands boundary. And so basically the extent is based on reptile and amphibian use of the wetlands in North Carolina. And so we figure out that they have routinely traveled further than 750 feet from the wetlands. But scientific research has indicated that if you have and maintain this 750-foot core area, that it will provide enough habitat for most priority species to complete an average migration into the surrounding uplands there. And so the 150-foot is considered the critical habitat zone around wetlands. And that initial 150-foot buffer is basically, it's where everything goes. This is where the breeding happens. This is where the feeding happens. This is the mainland. So if you think about this as being like your home, this is like, you know, the main bedroom of your house. And the 600 feet is more of the migration with changes to seasons. Where are they going to overwinter and that sort of thing there. So, you know, for instance, an even upper or a larger upland buffer is necessary to protect some other wetland associated species like the tiger salamander and the gopher frog. But this is just an example for planners when we're thinking about things is, hey, when you're putting your houses in or when you're arranging your neighborhood, you know, if you can provide these buffers or build them in, our wildlife would get a chance, okay? And then we also have, you know, the ephemeral pools and the small wetland communities that dry out seasonally in the summer and the fall. And so a lot of these are actually priority habitat listed in our action plan. And they provide habitat for multiple priority species. So these pools will include floodplain pools, upland pools, like the depression, the swamp forests that you see. And we have them in all state or in all parts of the state here, all regions. And so some of the species that are a priority for conservation include like the spotted salamander, the eastern tiger salamander, the mole salamander there on the bottom, the ornate chorus frog, and then the Carolina gopher frog. And in the Piedmont, you might consider some of these areas called bog habitat. That's a general classification for wetlands in the mountains in the western Piedmont. And, you know, they get that name. They're also really great habitat for bog turtles. So it's wetlands that are sunny and soggy and fed by groundwater and springs. And so here they talk about the interest in having the connectivity of a wildlife corridor. And they also talk about having some type of a vegetated cover, because again, if you're making space for animals to move and to migrate, it'd be nice if they have a margin of error on either side there. When we talk about habitats that are riparian or you know, we have the core terrestrial habitat that's in here. It consists of the stream or the river itself right there in the middle. So you see that kind of green portion there. And then we have, many terrestrial species, like the three-line salamander, from our birders, the cerulean warbler, the common ribbon snake, Raphanus big-eared bat, and they depend on riparian forests and floodplain forests. Great for insects, great for feeding, great for cover and overwintering as well as nesting. And so this particular area for conserving riparian and floodplain habitats is two different scales. In this plan, or in this recommendation rather, for developers, it is saying that we have to protect not only the core terrestrial habitat that we talked about earlier, but also think about it on a watershed scale. When we have significant flooding events, and the banks, well, the river is going to jump its banks, or we have, for instance, really dry times, how much of a buffer is actually necessary. And so you as a citizen, there's a lot of things that you can do, and I've included this in the list of resources as well. So, this is just a handful, but if you have the ability to build, a frog-friendly pond, even making a toad abode, this is a great opportunity. Like, you go to Walmart and you get the cheap little clay pots. You can use the bottom of that clay pot as a pollinator fountain, basically. You put shells or little rocks and things in there so they have something to alight on so they can drink water and not drown. And then you can flip the top over and make a nice little shady spot, a little cover spot for toads, and you will get toads. And having toads around your porch and patio, they poop a little bit. They're not as much as the Canada geese, though, but they'll eat some insects for you, too. And then I cannot say this enough for all animals, planting native vegetation in periods of drought like we're in right now. Those are plants that are drought resistant. They're very tolerant to our soils, regardless of where you are. If you plant native for the areas that you're in, they provide fall and winter interest, as well as blooms and seasonal berries or fruits and things that are nuts, depending on what you have. And it just kind of helps sustain multiple species throughout our seasons. And so that's the whole point, honestly, of managing for habitats, is we're focusing on a few species, but really we're helping many, many more. And this is how, again, with the ecotones, how we split up our state: mountains, Piedmont, sandhills, and the coastal plains. And so briefly, just very briefly, because I want to talk about gopher frog, and we'll make sure I have enough time. So North Carolina, up in the mountains, we have the highest elevation of any state east of the Mississippi River, with Mount Mitchell being the highest peak at 6,684 feet. And these are to be above mean sea level. So you have those spruce, I don't know why I can't say that, fir forests, and the low floodplain valleys. And again, a lot of biodiversity here, but the biggest issue is going to be flooding, right? So in the mountain region, we have frequent and severe flooding. It's resulted in damage to many sprees from debris blockages and erosion. And the Wildlife Resource Commission has reviewed numerous proposals for working in streams sponsored by the National Resources Conservation Service as part of their emergency watershed protection program. And that provides assistance to landowners to relieve basically imminent hazards to life and property from floods and other natural disasters. So in these proposals, we're not really concerned with returning streams to their original course and removing down trees and other debris. We're very concerned about proposals to dredge gravel and rock from stream beds and pile this material onto banks for stabilization. That has a greater potential to degrade the aquatic habitat, trout streams especially, and it's a short-term solution that creates a larger term problem for watersheds. And it works its way all the way downstream. So there's been some work on new reservoirs and things like that. And we work with state and federal agencies to make sure that any projects that are approved or major projects that have, we make recommendations on compensatory mitigation packages and things like that. So again, we're trying to make sure that, we have the greatest impact on what we're doing there as far as conserving those habitats for future generations, as well as the biodiversity that's there. And the Piedmont is the area east of the foot of the Blue Ridge Escarpment and west of the fall line. And so those are it also includes the foothill ranges, part of the mountain ecoregion there. And the fall line is actually a major break in the geologic structure between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And so you have a difference of ecosystem patterns with a variety of landscape reliefs and roughness. You have variation in elevation from 1,500 feet to down to 200 feet at the fall line. And so we have a lot of old fields and rock outcrops and streams and woodlands. And there's a lot of species diversity of reptiles and amphibians and birds super high in the Piedmont. The Sandhills is that southwestern portion we saw in the picture earlier, the upper coastal plain region, and it's the former coastline. So as you know, the Piedmont has experienced very rapid growth and development, and we have major highways and interstate systems and things like that that move through. So we work with a lot of different agencies, and I've actually included a list on the resources of all the agencies that we partner with, including the Department of Transportation, who we work with currently to make sure that we can provide wildlife safe passage over some of our major roadways, as well as identify other threats or major crossings and other projects that are going on. And in the coast, just to briefly kind of go over some of this, includes the mid-Atlantic areas east of the fall line, the tidal coast. So, that includes oceans and sounds and barrier islands, salt marshes, brackish water, and we have a tidewater area, which is the lower coastal plain, and then the inland is like flat and swampy, and then we also have some other areas that drain out pretty well, longleaf pine, thick Pocosin regions and things like that, but pretty low elevation. So we have the longleaf pine ecosystems that are very specific to a lot of our amphibious and reptile species, as well as birds and mammals, our wetlands and maritime forests. These are all really critical habitats for both our terrestrial and aquatic species. So wetlands and wetland loss continue to be a major concern. Small losses are particularly significant in the Piedmont, where wetlands are fewer in number, and assaults come to those in many different directions. So we have several different species in these particular area where we're working with the Natural Heritage Program and the NC Forest Service to try to implement and influence forestry best management practices so that we can help with our water quality in those particular areas. And we're also working to try to decrease habitat fragmentation. So just to kind of bring up something else in here in this particular area is we have our prescribed burns. So this is something that's very important. So frequent prescribed burns and fires keep shrubby scrub down, and it creates primary succession habitats. And these are slated to happen usually every 2 to 3 years to keep fuel sources down and increase the seeding efforts and nutrient improvement in these nutrient poor soils. Late summer burns in June and July, actually they mimic the natural lightning cycle that animals such as frogs and salamanders have adapted their reproductive cycle and movements around this particular occurrence. Now, this is preferred by biologists to have the late summer burns. If you burn too early in the spring, you'll actually burn up the amphibians as they transition from the uplands to the wetlands to breed and lay eggs. So the timing of these burns is very important. However, sometimes in some areas, you have cities that are literally right on top of these swaths of land that are conserved or public lands. And so your burning schedule may be altered by traffic flow and the amount of smoke that you can have blowing, by the way the wind is blowing that day, whether we're in a drought or not. Lately, we have a lot of our habitats are longleaf pine forests in areas that haven't had burns on a regular schedule because a lot of our burning teams and resources have been going out west to help fight those wildfires and things. So you don't just have a burn any old time. There are permits and things that are issued, and there's a lot of different players in that and trying to figure out the best time and what's best for the species. So prescribed fire is the most effective for these sites if it's conducted after the breeding ponds dry, because the fire burns across the entire wetland that way, and it encourages the grasses that are critical for egg deposition and tadpoles. They tend to eat on the grasses and things like that for that herbivory pattern, and it reduces the amount of fuel and organic matter that builds up. And when you get all that turf and everything that builds up, it lowers the pH in a lot of those ponds, and that will affect tadpole development and eggs and all that kind of thing as well. So if you have proper management, gopher frogs also benefit other species of conservation. So the ornate chorus frog, which is on our list, the tiger salamander, the maybe salamander, and many more. So the gopher frog actually, the breeding sites routinely support as many as 15 to 20, if not more, amphibian species. So when we protect just for the gopher frog, we literally get at least 4 handfuls worth of other vertebrates and invertebrate species and many rare plant species that we're protecting for. So in the longleaf pine flatwood areas, or the xeric longleaf pine shrub and scrub habitat, you typically will have permanent or ephemeral freshwater ponds and sinks that are invaluable to the animals that are found here, and it's bordered by the Pocosin habitats. Now, there are only an estimated 3.3 million acres of longleaf pine forest that remain from the original stand along the coast of North America of 90 million acres. And that's just a huge drop. Now, the southern chorus frog, the ornate chorus frog, maybe salamander, and the gopher frog are rare, and they're also winter breeders, which is why we prefer a late summer burn schedule, so we don't burn these guys up as they move from, they transition from upland areas to the wetland areas. And if you're thinking, oh, well, it can't be that far, right? It's a couple feet. No, you'd be wrong. The gopher frog can actually travel up to 2 miles from upland to wetland sites. And that journey takes them about a month to complete. So gopher frogs actually stay in stump holes that the prescribed burns create, and they use them as refugia, and a lot of other amphibians do too, including pygmy rattlesnakes that are reptiles, and a lot of other snake species. So many species benefit from that. Some other species that we have that are used in this longleaf pine forest, excuse me. So again, here we have the tiger salamander, the gopher frog, the mimic glass lizard that's in there, and the barking tree frog that's in there as well. So those are other species that benefit. Now, just to, let me see if I can answer some questions. I don't want to go too long, but I do want to tell you a little bit about the gopher frogs if I have a second, and then some of the citizen science initiatives really quickly, but I want to see if I'm missing any questions that are burning. Monty, you tell me what time. Okay. So Bill, with the tadpoles that are found, it really just depends on what species it is. And what I mean by that is basically, if it's a gopher frog, we go the extra mile. So let me tell you a little bit about that right now. So when it comes to our gopher frogs, so the original 23 populations that the Wildlife Commission staff basically found or created on the Sandhills Game Line in 2013, which is what you see up there. The same pond in 2019, the Gopher Frog Conservation Plan for North Carolina, 11 were detected and only 7 populations remain. So 7 out of the original 23 populations of gopher frogs that were in the wild remain. That's a 70% reduction. So of the 53 original pond sites, there are only 14 that are still used by gopher frogs. Most of them have been destroyed or they've been altered significantly. And one of the things that gopher frogs cannot cope with are fish. They need a fishless pond. Some frog species are like that, because their tadpoles can't compete. It kind of works its way down to the way that how well a tadpole is camouflaged. They found some research on that as well. So the better camouflage the tadpole is with spots and things like that, the more tolerant they are in fish ponds. And it just kind of depends as well as the maturity cycle and how long it takes them. But the lost populations of gopher frogs are probably not going to be recovered, but there's a lot of, the remaining populations face a lot of threats, including severe weather. So those long periods of drought, development, and then the lack of proper management of those forests, like not doing those timely burns and things to work down some of that brush. Imagine trying to start your month-long journey from the wetlands down to the ponds and things like that. And you can't get your way through the brush. It takes that much longer. You have, you're open to predators, exhaustion, all kinds of things. You're open to the elements as well. And by the time you get there, maybe the ponds are drying up. So just kind of an issue. But in 2011, the Wildlife Resource Commission started working with the aquarium at Fort Fisher and the North Carolina Zoo. And basically they collected small portions of gopher frog egg masses that they found in the wild. And then they hatched them out into tadpoles. And they raise them up in outdoor tanks like you see here. And the young frogs were then released back to the same locations where the eggs were collected. And these are called head starting efforts. And it was to augment the wild populations of gopher frogs. And so when you're collecting eggs, let me go to the next one. When you're collecting eggs from for the head starting, the egg samples, they collect the egg samples for genetic analysis of gopher frog populations. And so after they checked some initial information from Eastern Kentucky University, that we found there was very low genetic diversity amongst some of the populations of the egg masses of gopher frogs we collected. And so a longer term study is actually kind of needed on that. And it's been undertaken through a graduate student's research at UNCW. So hopefully this study will help inform some of our head starting efforts and identify populations that need the most attention. And when we do this head starting and the genetic analysis, we've made significant efforts to manage and restore the gopher frog habitat, as you see here. So we've specifically worked on game lands as well as other public lands with external partners, trying to fine tune the timing and intensity of prescribed burn on the landscape. And here you see gopher frogs actually prefer open canopy herbaceous wetlands. So in sites that have infrequent fires or fires outside of the late growing season, the wetland shrub and tree canopies develop. And so here are some pictures of folks working in the Sandhills Game Land and Holly Shelter Game Land. And we also work with Sunny Point and the Department of Defense as well. And so we have the staff in the Croatan as well that help work out with different agencies. And they're trying to open up some of these canopies and remove these heavy duff layers so that they can get to these particular wetlands that are used for them. So here you see commission staff, they're actually creating new ponds. This was back in October of 2013, specifically targeted by use for the gopher frog. And so as of 2018, gopher frogs have been bred in this artificially constructed wetland in at least 2 separate years. And we've pursued land acquisition and conservation lands that would support gopher frogs. 2 tracks were acquired adjacent to Sunny Point or Matsu, and 1 new breeding pond was discovered on these tracks. So we've reached out to landowners that have land that appeared suitable to gopher frogs, and we've gained access to several additional parcels, 2 of which have included newly discovered breeding ponds. So survey work for new sites will continue, but it appears that there are a few suitable areas that remain. And just to kind of show you a little bit, so that's a juvenile gopher frog on the left, and then that's actually a gopher frog in a defensive posture. They kind of throw their hands up like, if I can't see you, you can't see me, kind of thing there. Now, when we head start them and we release these juvenile frogs into undisclosed locations, they're re-released, but to make sure that we can separate them out or distinguish them from wild populations, biologists will actually inject, they have like an implant, VIE, visible implant elastomer, into the rear leg of a head-started gopher frog. So for consistency, biologists will actually mark the same spot, so either the right rear or the left rear leg for that particular year. But this, the VIE fluoresces under black light. Now, this is also helpful for recaptures because we also want to know, are they reproducing on their own in the wild, or is it just we're only putting them out there and we're not seeing any natural reproduction? Because we have noticed that with, for instance, things like striped bass and other species. So, you know, it's very important to say, hey, if these efforts aren't working, we got to go back to the drawing board. But biologists have only ever recaptured 1 so far, but it returned as an adult. So it got through all of its major life stages to come back and breed again, which is super hopeful when it comes to, you know, our gopher frogs. And no, we don't release and disclose locations for the gopher frog because this is, again, a state endangered species. So this is not something, if you find it, you want to put on iNaturalist and make it available to the public. Reptiles and amphibian illegal trade on the black market is actually more lucrative in North Carolina than the drug trade. So if you find a species that's rare or endangered or anything like that, we don't advertise that to the public. I included some of this stuff, so I'll run through it kind of quickly here, but basically here's an example of the Neuse River water dog and some conservation efforts there. So basically, this is just to let you know how much of a drought we're in. This is the first year since staff have been monitoring for gopher frogs for 15 years now, when no breeding was detected in any of the 7 populations. And we also noticed poor breeding conditions for the ornate chorus frog and southern chorus frog. And we do think that that's due to the drought. However, on the other hand, the Neuse River water dog proved very fruitful this year with survey efforts. So staff caught 46 water dogs on day 2 of the surveys. And there was 1 trap that had 14 individuals, which is pretty historical in terms of collection there. So among the 46 animals, staff caught 2 adults that were very large, 2 nearly 12 inches in length. And day 3, they caught 18 water dogs. So the total captures for the week included 78. So the salamanders were doing pretty well at this particular site. This is the webpage that each one of you should have. It's called www.herpsofnc.org. This is one that gives you a species profile, a map of where it occurs geographically. It will also play calls if it's a frog or a toad. And it has all the information that you need that you could possibly find. Several pictures for identification. It is also listed in the resources guide that I'm giving you. And as you see, this is also with the NC Park. So I'll go over them in just a second, but this is very reputable. You can buy a book version for frogs and toads on Amazon for pretty cheap if you can find it, but it is out of print. And this site is updated more regularly than anything that's in print right now. But as you can see, you click on snakes, turtles, lizards, gators, frogs and toads and salamanders, all of those things, and they'll show you several pictures that's there. And then just briefly to go over, and I know Monty, I'm over time. So we're talking about NC Park here. This is another organization I encourage each and every one of you to look into if possible. They're the North Carolina Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. and they're an official state chapter. They include conservation of all reptiles and amphibians, conserving habitats HERP require for survivals. It includes individuals and organizations and agencies that have an interest in reptiles and amphibian conservation, as well as academia, museums, pet trade industries, herpetological societies, even in your neighborhood. And it's free membership. So they not only focus on endangered and threatened species, but also on keeping native species, common species as native species, keeping them common. And they have all kinds of projects and working groups you can get involved in. And this is also in your list of resources, so don't worry. Now, if you want to learn and monitor frog populations, CASP, the Calling Amphibian Survey Program, is one that you can get involved in. So it's kind of the long-term tracking of frog and toad distributions and relative abundance over time in North Carolina. So they have set surveys that you go to and you walk and you figure out what's there. Now, USGS, and I included this in there as well, they have a public quiz that you can take. You can narrow it down to your specific state, and they will play songs for you to listen to, and you figure out which particular one it is. And to do a CASP survey, you actually have to learn enough of these calls to identify them, because you're not catching them, you're listening for them to see if they're there. And so I put this in there, but there's a USGS frog quiz that's really, really helpful. And this is all a citizen run endeavor. And as you can see, it's also with NC Park as well. And so in 2006, North Carolina had 61 original random routes generated through the North American Amphibian Monitoring Program. So we're pretty good about it. If you want something that doesn't have as stringent of details and surveys, it's the CASP is kind of intense if you're just starting out. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums have Project or Frog Watch USA. It's a very easy to follow protocol. It's more loosely bound. It's not full of as many rules. And then we were talking about Seek is a great app. We also have Herp Mapper, and this is a worldwide way to track amphibian and reptile populations. And so what's cool is that you can actually submit an observation. You can look for different species. People upload pictures, but you see all the dots there on the map, and you can see where it starts. The more observations, the hotter that area becomes. And it basically helps biologists present you can create all of your herp observations, but you get a map of abundance right here. So your observations are very valuable, and it helps with many other university run projects, state agency, national prioritization of some of these species as well. All of your data is being used. And I'm sorry, I know I ran long, but that was a lot to try to run through, and I apologize for running over time. But does anybody have any questions or anything I can address? We'll send out those resources, Monty. I don't know if you want to talk more about if it'll be tomorrow morning or night.
Yeah, and you're getting some feedback on the chat. Everybody thinks this is really great, and I want to echo that as well. You covered a lot of territory tonight, and it was extremely informative. And I know we got a late start, so again, apologies to everybody for the late start. I know that created extra pressure for you, Becky. Thank you for sticking with it. What we'll do is we'll take your slides. If you'll send them to me, Rebecca, I will put them up on our website. For those of you that go to our website, southwayconservationist.org, on the right-hand side, you'll see SWC meeting content is on the sidebar. You just click on that. You can go to tonight's meeting. And once we post these slides, you'll be able to access them. And I think all these links that you've got are in your slides, right, at the end. So you'll be able to get those.
Yeah, and that way you can look at them more in depth.
Right.
And I promised Bill to ask my herpetologist about the toxic secretions, if there are any that are toxic to humans amongst salamanders. And Jennifer, I hope you use and herps of NC to find your salamander, because they have a lot of great photos and things there.
Okay.
And if anybody is interested in getting the salamander poster, if just indicate to Monty or Tara, and we'll get that in the works and let you know when that's available. But I did include in the resources the note cards that go with it, which is kind of a little short area. And there's a little PDF, but that doesn't show you what you want to see. That's not really helpful when it's printed out. It's too small. But they are quite beautiful, and they're great wall art if anybody would like some.
That's fantastic. I'm sure there's a lot of people going to look forward to that. So thank you so much for sharing all this with us. And thanks for all you do as an outdoor educator for everybody out in the various, I guess, eastern half of the United States of
North Carolina, I can't do the United States.
Limited to North Carolina. I think
Thank you so much.
Yep, we'll need to close. I wish we had more time for dialogue, but I think we've kind of reached our limit. I know people need their evening. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining tonight. And again, check out the website. You'll see these slides out there, and watch for future programs. Have a good night.
Have a great night. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.